Am I audible to all? Just to making clear that the sound is in good order. Thank you all very much for coming. I'd like to thank Robert for the invitation as well. I must say I always enjoy the company at these New Direction events, like-minded enough to keep things friendly, but heterodox enough to keep things spirited and contentious, which is just what we want, of course. So we're going to be talking on the topic of working class conservatism today. And I suppose the focus of my remarks is going to be on what people call populism. The whole complaint of populists, of course, is that democracy is a noble ideal from which we have strayed. They make the case, populists make the case, that true democracy has been killed off by a hyper-progressive, self-serving, out-of-touch establishment, and that this betrayal has occurred most of all at the expense of Europe's native working classes. In the 21st century, I believe, any conservative-minded counter-elite worth its salt must either act in the interests of these people or resign themselves to the only plausible alternative, which is one of indefinite left-wing political domination. Bear in mind, too, that the left of this century will be nothing like the left of the last. The genuine heirs to people like Keir Hardie and Clement Attlee, well represented by people today like Kate Hoey and Lord Maurice Glasman, do not have demographic momentum on their side. The 21st century left will consist of activists more inclined to condemn someone like Winston Churchill as a racist, genocidal maniac than to smile at the thought of having served in his war cabinet, as indeed Attlee himself did, in the role of Deputy Prime Minister. At least since Tony Blair, I would submit, the former party of the proletariat, I think this applies globally as well, but my main focus, as you can tell from my plummy accent, is going to be Britain. At least since Tony Blair, the former party of the proletariat has been consciously dependent on minority voting blocs, having ditched solidarity with the working man for the politics of racial, ethnic, and religious grievance. Andrew Neither, a former speechwriter for Blair, once had an unwise moment of candor in the Evening Standard, admitting that under New Labour, mass immigration was partly, quote, intended to rub the right's nose in diversity and render their arguments out of date. The same strategy has been pursued by other legacy left-wing parties across Europe and North America. Both Bill Clinton and Joe Biden are on record gloating about the involuntary demographic transformation of the United States. In the case of regime journalists, it is even more on the nose. Only a couple of days ago, Jennifer Rubin, a Washington Post opinion writer and left-wing talking head on MSNBC, posted to her 700,000 followers on X, quote, there are nearly 500,000 Haitians in Florida. Someone should start running ads. No doubt when she finds herself on the back foot in other contexts, Rubin is the kind of dishonest actor to insist that Haitians have assimilated wonderfully into the United States. Were that true, of course, she would not be encouraging Democrats to appeal to them as a distinctive political subgroup. Nobody ever does this with German Americans or Huguenot-descended Brits. Such blatant ethnopolitics is nothing short of subversion. Alas, that subversion has been remarkably successful. In Britain, well over 70% of ethnic minorities swing to the left, and this also holds in the United States, as in other countries that have pursued reckless immigration policies without the consent or interests of their own people in mind. California used to be a fairly competitive state, the home of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, but this is true no longer. Decades of demographic churn have seen to that, and I, for one, am in favor of noticing these facts and adjusting accordingly. As for the political realignment that's going on at the moment, the failure of the mainstream right to do any such thing in response to these facts is staggering, as the consequences of mass immigration, among other unpopular policy choices, have played out. The loyalties of the native working classes have dramatically shifted. The entire axis of politics has turned, yet the centre-right has been too busy microwaving the talking points of the 80s to notice. Populist parties are capitalizing because their mainstream rivals have not bothered to do so. Considered collectively, it is true, these populists do encompass a rather varied smorgasbord of ideological positions. These include everything from the supply-side Thatcherism of Farage's Reform UK to the more dirigiste approach of Le Pen's Rassemblement National, from the lifestyle liberalism of Geert Wilders to the proactively traditionalist family policy of Viktor Orban's Fidesz, from the uncompromising Atlanticism of Giorgia Meloni to the more skeptical America First posture of one Donald J. Trump. But what unites this otherwise very disparate coalition of movements is, I think, a desire for social, cultural, and indeed demographic security at a time when identity, not politics, has conquered all before it. Identity, not economics, has conquered all before it to become the main issue in our politics. While inequality and the disruptive effects of globalization are an important part of the story as well, I believe that mass immigration is the main driver of this seismic change. Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations is playing out not only between competing geopolitical blocs, but within Western democracies, so suicidally open-minded at the border, they have invited balkanization upon themselves. Meanwhile, as we confront a new breed of radical leftist, more interested in weaponizing racial resentments than nationalizing the ice cream industry, much of the mainstream right continues to act as if we are up against old-fashioned socialists like Michael Foot, a museum piece, if ever there was one, born in Plymouth as long ago as 1913. While it has become commonplace to describe populist voters as hailing from the left-behind towns and neighborhoods, they are in fact more up to speed on what politics is now about than the politicians who claim to represent them. In Britain, the Tories spent 14 long years alienating this core vote while failing to hoover up support from the kinds of people who will always hate their guts in any case. They flirted with the luxury belief class while ignoring ordinary heartbreaks, pandered to foreign diasporas that lean overwhelmingly to the left, while stigmatizing the very idea that Britain's host population might have collective interests of its own, and joined in the liturgical celebrations of the LGBT cult while distancing themselves from the married family. They were then deservedly trounced in the recent general election, and what was it all for? They hardly get any credit in the huffy diatribes of LBC's James O'Brien or the very important and high-status FT editorial page. It is no wonder, then, that a working-class backlash, led by populist insurgents, is gathering steam. Among Britain's overrepresented political constituency of midwit Times readers, it is popular to dismiss Clacton-on-Sea, ground zero for Nigel Farage's declared revolt against a cosy Westminster consensus, as a town going nowhere. This is a phrase you will encounter often. Its etiolated Victorian terraces and repurposed semi-retro arcades give the lie to such scornful notions. Whatever Clacton's eventual destiny, this is a town that finds itself adrift from somewhere. Clacton is the very definition of left behind. Its equivalents in the United States would be post-industrial wastelands like Steubenville, Ohio, and Wheeling, West Virginia. An Essex seaside town, Clacton was a well-subscribed domestic holiday destination for middle-class English families until the advent of cheap commercial travel and cheap commercial flights in particular in the 1970s wiped out the bustling local economy. No one goes to Clacton on holiday in England anymore. It has since sunk into a haven of economic stagnation, welfare dependency, and public ill health. While local circumstances invariably differ, there are similar patterns up and down the country, across Europe, and across North America, of course, as well. While Reform UK won 5 such seats, it is not a coincidence that they came second, most often to Labour, in 98 others at the recent general election. There are whole swathes of working-class voters waiting to be pinched from Sir Keir Starmer, or indeed roused from their disillusionment to vote for a truly patriotic national party. Our new elite's contempt for such people became even more blatant after Axel Rudikubana's mass slaughter of young girls at a Taylor Swift dance class back in August. Despite countless imported horrors, from industrial rape gangs and endemic knife crime to sectarian infighting and Islamist intimidation, it was only once a backlash had been triggered among Britain's working classes predominantly that we saw a sudden concern for law and order setting in among our otherwise feeble leaders. Ministers and magistrates rushed to show a sentimental toughness that would have made Nixon blush amid the turmoil of 1968. Overall, a majority of British people, no matter how they voted in the recent election, believe that immigration policy in recent years must shoulder some of the blame for this recent civil unrest. When elected leaders consistently defy public opinion, it is no surprise that the more hot-headed among us, wrongly but understandably, resort to expressing themselves through violence instead of the ballot box. Worse still, these underlying concerns will not be addressed anytime soon, and they will never be addressed at all unless right-wing parties, be they populist or mainstream, ditch strategies that are not only treacherous, for that is bad enough, but losing and ineffective. The electoral consequences of demographic change were clear enough 20 years ago. In 2000, George W. Bush lost 10 of the 15 states with the most foreign-born residents. 10 out of 15 with the most foreign-born residents George W. Bush lost in 2000. He swept to victory in all 10 of the states with the smallest share of foreign-born: Montana, Mississippi, Wyoming, West Virginia, South Dakota, North Dakota, South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Nevertheless, under the influence of Republican strategist Karl Rove, the party establishment, right up until the Trump revolution, continued to fish around obsessively for minorities while neglecting the very voters that had guaranteed their political fortunes from Harry Truman onwards. The only Democrat in the post-war era to beat a Republican rival to a larger share of the white vote was Lyndon Baines Johnson in his 1964 landslide. Now, let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I am not calling on right-wing parties to adopt a whites-only approach or to tar all minorities with the same scornful brush. This would be both wrong and counterproductive. Apart from anything else, there are a fair few minorities whom Eric Kaufmann, the political scientist with whom some of you may be aware, describes as ethno-cultural traditionalists. That's a coinage of Kaufmann's. People like my friend, Momus Najmi, I should tell you that he's Pakistani just to give myself some cover, who sincerely does love Britain, despite not hailing from Britain. But crucially, and this is the crucial criteria which qualifies someone as an ethno-cultural traditionalist, he loves Britain because he associates what is good about the country with its historic people, not with a David Cameron-style laundry list of ill-defined abstract values. Such minorities want to preserve the British people, or indeed the Irish people if it comes to that, in the same way that I would want to preserve the Japanese people if my heart ever moved me to live in Tokyo. What I'm saying then is that conservatives should not be trying to seduce minorities at the expense of their more reliable voter base. The American left never goes out of its way to court evangelical voters or gun owners. This is because, for all their faults, they are cunning political strategists, and they realize that these are solidly Republican constituencies. Electorally speaking, they hunt where the ducks are, and I'm suggesting that it's about time we do likewise. I will conclude with a plea that we distinguish between populist appeal, which I wholeheartedly applaud, and populist methods, which I believe will get us nowhere. One problem we face today is that, with the exception potentially, and there may be some others that people might want to suggest, but with the distinctive exception of Viktor Orban in Hungary, the populist right lacks serious leadership. People like Farage, who's obviously irresistible on a certain level, but people like Farage have proved themselves, so far at least, to be more addicted to spearheading ostentatious pressure campaigns than making serious bids for power and the responsibility that comes with it. We get calls for fresh referendums and are invited to enjoy entertaining pieces to camera on GB News, but encounter little in the way of policy detail or serious strategic planning. There are legitimate concerns that reform, again to speak primarily of my own country, is not much more than a one-man band, a media-fueled enterprise with limited potential to scale beyond the admittedly irresistible persona of Farage himself. I should say that I hope that I'm wrong, but I think we need to understand something which came much more naturally to our forebears than it does for us, because we, of course, labour under a democrat ethos in our modern age. And the unpopular truth is that politics is not primarily something engaged in by people. It is primarily a struggle within elites and between elites. As George Bernard Shaw once put it, 2% of the people think, 3% of the people think they think, and 95% of people would rather die than think. Since you're all here, you're probably safe, I should say. But given that rough breakdown, politics is bound to attract the most ambitious, highly motivated individuals within the first two categories. And more often, it must be said, the slightly higher number of people who think they think rather than those who actually do. No elite can exist without such people, the genuine visionaries and the deluded chancers alike. The fatal flaw in populism is that it bets on the preferences of the people being ultimately decisive. In truth, while the people can and should send messages at the ballot box, it's important that they do that, it is up to a much smaller number of people to decide how these are processed, indeed whether they get acted upon at all. It's partly that pattern which accounts for our existing frustrations, the way in which people are constantly making their preferences eminently clear in election campaigns and seeing very little in the way of practical results. This is why I believe if democracy is to work, it is actually more important that the people should feel able to identify with the values of their elite class than they should possess a de jure freedom under the law to participate in the affairs of government. Without this spirit of identification, this fundamental spirit of moral and national identification, the technical right to vote every 5 years amounts to very little. Populists, then, counterintuitively, must reconcile themselves to pursuing a kind of elite standing, despite the fact that this will mean giving up the insurgent underdog status with all of its exhilarating qualities that the word populism evokes. And I should say that the populists of classical antiquity, as indeed the populists of other ages, demonstrate this fact. This was true of Julius Caesar. He was transgressive when crossing the Rubicon, but by the time he had triumphed over Pompey in the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar was in a powerful enough position to show clemency towards his former opponents in the Senate and have them install him as the effective dictator of Rome. And another important clarification, this is not to say that we should be clamoring for Caesar-like figures, but his breathtaking success until his assassination, of course, goes to show that populists in the Caesarian mold cannot be indulgently and forever outside the mainstream if they wish to get anything done. If democracy sets the people free, the price of this freedom is vigilance. But while the people, particularly today, are no doubt wiser than their elites, they tend to be poor guardians of the power that democracy theoretically confers on them. They are very easily dispossessed, as we have seen, by better organized minorities, however fanatical those minorities happen to be, if you speak to them. And in the absence of an elite that shares their values and interests, the people will be overpowered and molded, and remolded indeed, by one that does not. So, to conclude, we must replace our new elite with an alternative in which the average citizen, particularly among the West's native working classes, sees his own values and priorities reflected back to him. This is a long-term project, no doubt, but the result need not be another oligarchic monstrosity that hides from the electorate and pulls levers from behind the scenes. If successful, our reward will be a patriotic guardian class, only too happy to show its face among the people. Populism is either the prelude to a new and better elite, or it is a lone, forgettable crescendo in the grand score of history.
Hi, everyone. That was excellent, wasn't it? Thank you very much to New Direction for having me here, to Michael and Gary for the invite. My name is Niamh Bhriain. I'm a correspondent with and a founder of Gript Media. And I'm going to talk to you today about identity, immigration, and the need for real political diversity. And I'm going to begin by saying in 1645, the brilliant Irish general Eoin Rua O'Neill marshalled his troops at Benburb and spurred them to victory against the forces of Robert Monroe by reminding them that they were a people whose ancestors had occupied this country for more than 3,000 years. And he was relying on an instinct that is as ancient as history itself. And that's our need for identity, our need for belonging, for freedom and for sovereignty. It's why culture and traditions and language and rootedness and community and that shared memory we have, it's why all those things matter. It's why the concept of a nation under God or under a sovereign or both, or as representative of a people sharing commonalities and identity and history, continues to resonate, continues to offer meaning and stability. Because as one of our most famous leaders here in Ireland, Pádraig Pearse, said, the good of the nation means ultimately the good of the individual men and women who compose the nation. And as you all know, both socialism and now more often globalism have long been arrayed against that strong binding force of national identity. In contrast, the alignment of conservatism with nationalism is obvious to me, since both systems and ideologies seek to preserve structures and concepts and values that best serve societies, especially in relation to its most fundamental units, such as the family, and its fundamental constructs, such as freedom. And all of this, I think, is important as background because the immigration crisis that Europe is now facing, a crisis which is also in many ways an opportunity, has, I would argue, led or at least can lead to a revival of public understanding of the importance of national identity. And the most obvious recent example of a reaction to the unprecedented wave of immigration being experienced into Europe that is rooted, or that was rooted in national identity, is, of course, Brexit. And many of you will remember, no doubt, the frankly insulting and often abusive media reporting around that seismic event. You remember how Leave voters were depicted as ignorant and backward and racist. And it was, the chattering classes decided, both in Ireland as well as in England, most regrettable that those voters had been given the opportunity to drag Britain backwards. That's how they saw it. And In Ireland, when the role of immigration in the Brexit vote was discussed, Leave voters were most often, I think, accused of nostalgia for empire, because those making that claim understood how that would resonate with Irish people. And they were also accused of a small-minded rejection of other cultures. But I think what later became acknowledged, or eventually acknowledged, and backed up by research from UCL and Stockholm University, for example, was that those people who valued British identity were more likely to be in favour of leave, in other words, to be pro-leave. And the question that was never asked in the Irish media discussions of Brexit, which usually, in fairness, amounted to little more than just a prolonged wringing of hands, was what on earth was wrong with that? What is wrong with valuing your own identity? Now, I'm saying that as somebody who comes from a long, unbroken line of unrepentant Irish Fenians. But I would hold it entirely natural for a British person to love their country and cherish their identity just as I do mine. And the dismay expressed by the elites in this country and elsewhere, by those who almost comically see themselves as the great and the good, at Brexit, at Trump, at the result of elections in Hungary and France, and at the growth of new political groupings like Vox in Spain, for example, comes mostly from a place of anger, in my opinion, because the voters didn't vote as they were expected to. They didn't vote as they were told to, and therefore they all had to belong to a basket of deplorables. That's what the elites say, not because the views of these voters are genuinely deplorable, but because they weren't listening to those who had decided how voters should vote, who had decided how the country should be run. And that's why populism is so disparaged by the establishment parties and the establishment media. They try to portray it as an expression of ignorance. But really it's because they don't like the way populism is often an expression of the ordinary voter, seeking the best for the individual, the best for their community, and the best for their country. And on what has now become the thorniest and most urgent of issues, immigration, the fury of the liberal establishment and their anger, and that of the media, which supports them on almost all of their causes, cannot bear to brook any dissent, not because they are blind to the reality of what is happening in regard to immigration, but precisely because they know what is at stake. Because the data, the facts and figures are stark, and I'd imagine they're well known to everybody in this room, so I'm not going to rehash many of them. It might be suffice to say that it's 7 years since Douglas Murray wrote The Strange Death of Europe, detailing how rapidly declining birth rates and concurrent spiralling immigration rates could lead to a kind of suicide of European civilization. And since the publication of that book, since those 7 years, things have actually got much worse. According to the European Commission, in the EU, in 2023, 22% of people aged 15 to 74 years were either foreign-born or a descendant of foreign-born persons. 29 million immigrants have arrived into Europe in the past decade, legally and illegally, with a total number of non-EU nationals entering the EU reaching 5.1 million in 2022. And the sheer scale, I think, of those numbers can be difficult to grasp. That's why snapshots, I think, can help. So last year, in just 4 days, nearly 12,000 illegal immigrants came by sea to Lampedusa, a small Italian island of just 6,000 inhabitants. Most of you will have seen the photographs, I think, the media coverage of that event. And the impact, I think, of that snapshot was astonishing. And Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni at the time said that the EU needed to join Italy and Hungary in a greater commitment to fighting against the human trafficking networks and creating an effective return policy. And I think this is what's interesting. Other European leaders used to be vocally critical of Meloni's policies, but now we have the British Labour Party Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, applauding Italy's strategy, seeking to stop migrants from reaching the country, whilst the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, is defending Italy's proposed deal for offshore processing with Albania. The German authorities, long lauded for their commitment to multiculturalism, seems to have shifted. Reacting to public anger in the wake of the murderous attacks by what Le Monde described as radicalised refugees in Mannheim and Solingen, They have reintroduced border controls at Germany's land borders and is now deporting Afghan refugees to Kabul. In Hungary, Viktor Orban's government has threatened to send illegal immigrants from Budapest to Brussels by bus. Hungary's Prime Minister has also described the crisis facing Europe in regard to immigration and as an existential issue. And measures to tackle the soaring immigration rates are not confined to the right. In Denmark, the tough policies championed by the Social Democrats are meant, they argue, to protect the less well-off and the disadvantaged, those most negatively disadvantaged by large-scale immigration, their Prime Minister claims. Yet there are precious few establishment voices championing Irish people in similar positions, despite the obvious chaos being caused by rocketing immigration rates into this tiny country. Indeed, I think a lot of people would describe the left in Ireland as the useful idiots of big capital when it comes to this issue. And what we see is that the government's deeply unpopular immigration policies are being battered through at the point of a Garda or police baton. The shocking scenes in small villages like Newtown and Kennedy, where pepper spray and riot police were used against those ordinary people opposing an asylum centre, represented a serious rupturing in the previously easy relationship between Gardaí, Garda Síochána, the Irish police, and ordinary people in the Republic. In 2023, the Central Statistics Office tells us the population in Ireland rose by 98,700 people. This was the largest 12-month increase since 2008. There were 149,200 immigrants in 2023, which was a 17-year high, and this was a third successive 12-month period where over 100,000 people immigrated to Ireland. The number of people living in asylum accommodation has soared from under 7,000 in 2020 to almost 32,000 this week. Thousands of those have come to this country without passports or identifying documents, yet almost none are deported. Most of those claiming asylum are not, in fact, from war-torn countries. Last week, the largest number, for example, came to Ireland from Nigeria. Nigerians make up the largest number of people occupying asylum accommodation in Ireland, followed by Georgians. Georgia is also not a war-torn country. In addition, more than 100,000 Ukrainians have arrived in Ireland since the outbreak of the war. And the impact of this huge surge in numbers arriving into a small country already struggling with an ever-deepening housing crisis, record levels of homelessness, chaos in the health service, and now a critical shortage of teachers. The impact of that should have been perfectly obvious. Yet the few TDs and senators, and they really were only a handful, who spoke up initially, mostly independent TDs, that's our MPs, or those from A&2, were absolutely savaged by the establishment parties and by the media for doing so. Carl Nolan TD, for example, an independent, was told by the Minister for Housing, Darragh O'Brien, that her call for the government to assess how many refugees and immigrants the country could take, she was told that that was a threat to social cohesion. Now the same minister is belatedly acknowledging that immigration is a factor in the strain on housing. But the truth is that most of the government and the opposition are in complete lockstep on this issue. There's a need for a real diversity of thought in Irish politics, but it's not the kind of diversity that would be championed by DEI programmes or the army of NGOs currently bleeding the Irish taxpayer dry. But the question to me isn't simply one of resources, and this is where the words of Owen Rua and Pearse and the issue of national identity actually matter. My colleague in Gript Media, Matt Tracy, dug into the figures released by the CSO and by Eurostat to find that 22% of people living in Ireland in 2023 were born overseas. That figure jumped almost 10%, up from 20% in just 1 year. It was 20% in 2022. This is a radical, radical change to this country, and it has happened almost entirely without any debate. Ireland now has the fourth largest proportion of non-national population of all 27 EU member states, behind only Luxembourg, Malta and Cyprus. What does that mean for Ireland's identity? What does it mean for our culture, our structures, and our traditions. What happens when the proportion of people living in this country who are foreign-born reaches 30% or 40%? Could it be the case that we are heading for a situation where Irish people could become a minority in our own country? And these are enormous, existential, essential questions. So why are we not having these conversations? Why are these conversations shut down and censored? Why are we afraid of having this debate? As Dan O'Brien, the chief economist with the Institute of International and European Affairs, said recently, Ireland is unlike any other country in Europe. We haven't had a discussion about what is the right level of immigration for this country. The lack of discussion is, of course, absolutely deliberate. It's not happening because those in power don't want it to happen. But polls repeatedly show that a huge majority of Irish people, between two-thirds and three-quarters, believe that Ireland has taken in too many refugees. And snapshot polls also repeatedly show that immigration is a primary concern for voters, as important as housing. But that significant majority is grossly underrepresented in the Dáil, in our Parliament. And voters aren't really to blame, I feel, sometimes for this failure. Michael Dwyer, who you heard from earlier, said in his podcast last week, if you don't listen to The Right Side, you should, it's great, with Gary Kavanagh. He said if you are given a bad menu in a restaurant, you can't be faulted for choosing a bad meal. And right now, the two most essential developments required in Ireland are political coherence and a media that challenges the consensus. Gript is working towards the latter. The next few weeks will reveal whether the former has made any advance. The polls show that at least 20% of voters are looking for independent candidates in the forthcoming election. They're looking for candidates who broadly oppose the establishment on issues like immigration. They are abandoning Sinn Féin. They're abandoning the opposition party because they feel that Sinn Féin has abandoned them on the immigration issue and on other issues. Time will tell whether a shift occurs, not just in policy, but in the broad sweep of history, in the sense that matters more than short-term metrics, that speaks to continuity and the sense of ancient belonging that drove Owen Rua at Benburb. Thank you very much.
It's great to be here in the New Direction Academy. I would like to thank Robert for putting the invitation out. It was a great pleasure to accept. If I knew I was going to have a Britney Spears style headset, I would have said yes even quicker. So I'm just waiting for the snake to arrive. Perhaps not. Won't indulge in any of her Instagram posts though, so you're lucky for that. It's great to be back in Ireland. I used to live in Ireland when I was a late teenager. I was a teenager once. I wasn't very good at it. But I used to live in a place called Longford. And Longford, to go and get a good pint of stout, you had to go to this little local place. And it was, you go through, it was a hardware store. And then you go through the hardware store, and there was a pub right behind it. And there was a caption on the wall of a headline in a newspaper, which they had framed, and it says, "The only place in the world where you can buy a hammer and get hammered." So it's great. It's great to be back in Ireland. It's a country I adore. So thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to talk about working class conservatism. Right, there's the title, "Perceiving the Angel in the Marble." Where's that from? Who said it? Benjamin Disraeli, great. Has anyone said that? Well done. So Disraeli, so this idea of working class conservatism is not new. It's not a new thing. The Conservatives have been looking at it and how to adapt to it since Disraeli in the Victorian times. So first of all, we can look at a definition of conservatism, and it's a short one from Roger Scruton, and let me just read it to you. Conservatism is a philosophy of inheritance and stewardship. As you can see, inheritance and stewardship. Conservatism is, by its very nature, cross-class. It is not a class-based philosophy. You can be working class, middle class, upper class, and still want to do those very things. You want to preserve your inheritance and pass it on to your children and grandchildren, and you want to buy a home, live in your neighborhood, stewardship of your town, village, city. So that's my first point. So I'm an academic, unfortunately. Don't hold it against me. Token Tory in the academy. And you can see in all the literature, the framing is that a working class conservative is an oddity. It's strange. It shouldn't be that way because it's a class-based philosophy for the upper classes. Here's Disraeli, and I won't read it all to you, but I'll just pick it out. This is what I'm not saying. What I'm saying is not new. For example, this is not new. So back to Disraeli again. None are so interested in maintaining the institutions of their country are the working classes. Maintaining the institutions of their country, be it the family, be it the local pub where you can buy a hammer and get hammered, where it is your little platoon, your nation state. So it's the idea of people defending and being able to defend popular institutions, like the ones I've just made. So let me just turn to the British context for a moment. That the idea of that if you are working class and you vote Conservatives is an oddity. Let's just look at that. Keep that in your mind while I'm speaking. What's happened in the British Social Survey attitude is that we can see that people previously, why would they vote for a sort of social democratic party and not conservative? I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Was because they prioritised their economic security. If you're economically insecure, this argument goes, that you then prioritise your economic security. But we can see that there has been a shift off this idea of left-right axis, where you got it's not very good, but you've got the statist on the one side and a more free market on the other, let's say, to the other axis, which is a socio-cultural axis. You could call this either a liberal, a conservative axis. And what's happened is that British people have started to take culture more seriously, more politically, and they've started to favour their cultural over their economic. This is a wider thing. I just want to throw out there this idea of a post-material society. Just keep that hanging in your mind while I'm talking. So this cultural access is essentially what they refer to as unconventional lifestyles versus traditional cultural conservative lifestyles. So we can see successes in places like in Italy and Sweden, and in the country which I'm also associated with through marriage. My wife is Finnish, and you can see that when the Conservative Party, they've got a proportional representation system, which of course gives disproportionate power to minority parties. But anyway, I'll move on. There you can see that the core Conservative Party, which is called Kokoomus, National Coalition Party, has been embedded in this middle class idea of liberal conservatism. And you can see then on the outside a very, very popular like True Finns, or they call themselves Sininen, which is blue, or other parties growing on the more populist, national populist type of conservatism and doing well. What do they talk about? They talk about identity, reduction of immigration, and so on. So there's Maloney, who's already been mentioned, so I won't talk about this, but some people have said that Maloney was a critical juncture, that you can see that this is a revival. Could we see a revival in this way in other places like Ireland? And I would like to chat to you about that, or we could perhaps discuss it in the open segment. So we can see also a generational shift that's going on, a shift away from Christian democracy in Europe to national populists and a revival. You may think that's a positive, you may think it's a negative, I'm not sure, but it's happening. But the topic itself, working class conservatism, is difficult, because how do you define class? So if you get in to the nitty-gritty of what is class, or should it be class is there plural in working classes? And how much does class shape voting behaviour? Do we, in Britain, a country like Britain, it's particularly strong, or it has been, and it's starting to break down, but it has been a reliable indicator of your voting behaviour. Also things like your religion, your ethnicity, regional identity, if you're from a particular part of the country. People from Ireland would tell you that Cork is different from Dublin, and Dublin is different from Longford, and Longford is different from Sligo. And you can see differences in regional stories, the stories that they tell each other, heroes that they have, etc. I say that I try to tease this out with my students when I talk about class, and I've come up with what I call the Wayne Rooney test. So Wayne Rooney was born in one of the poorest parts of Liverpool. He is now, I think he's a football coach of some football team somewhere named Plymouth. And I asked my students, what class is Wayne Rooney? And then I just let that again hang there. So then I tell them there are a few ways of defining class. Money, if you have it or if you don't. But more importantly, actually how you spend your money, which creates class. How do you spend it? Do you go to watch football or rugby? Do you go and watch horse racing, or do you go and watch dog racing, etc.? Do you go to the rowing regattas? That how do you spend your money is just important as actually having it. Your profession or your trade, or that difference, if you are a professional or a tradesperson. One that really held sway in Britain for a long time was an academic named Ross, did this you and non-you language. So the terms that you use, so do you say graveyard or cemetery? Do you say pardon or what? These sort of things when you address. And it was very interesting. I got my students to do this, and my students, they were young, and they went dominantly for money. Your class is through how much money you have. If you are rich, you are upper class. If you are poor, you are working class. That's how they dominantly saw it, and only a very few, small segment, not even a third, thought it was traditionally to do with language, how you dress, how you speak, what profession you have, and so on. So they were dominantly about money, and this informs their politics. I'm on the side of the working classes because they have no money. I'm very altruistic and so on, so I support them. Abstractly, of course. Abstractly. Not your poor relative or your poor neighbour who lives next door to you. Not helping that poor, the abstract poor, a concept. Not going out in that charitable Christian way of giving money and not wanting your name splattered everywhere about it. Quiet charity, no, to individual people or to organisations. So, class interests, as I said, is commonly associated with working class socialism. The idea of talking about working class conservatism is an absurdity in many universities. But it's not true. Between a third and a half, it fluctuates, between a third and a half of working class people vote Conservative. Has done since Stanley Baldwin. And when people do well, if you want to see when Conservatives do well, look at Margaret Thatcher, look at her vote. Who voted? Half working class voted for her. Boris Johnson, 2019, working classes voted more for the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson than for Labour. Conservatives win when they go for and win, and I told you they do, between a third and a half. They fluctuate between this continually. So it's not a myth that there is working class conservatism. It's actually fundamental to election results. What's the answers to this then? Marxists would say this is false consciousness. They are voting against their own economic interests. Of course, that's both false. It's purely deference. Working class people vote for their betters. Again, that's not true. There's also another response that they see themselves as middle class, not as working class, even if they still are working class. But what it really is, it's political allegiance as an extension of their values and beliefs. It's what they believe. It's what they believe. If they want to defend that stewardship, that inheritance, their local pub, their history, they will vote for it. It's not this extension of culture is an extension of politics. That's why. Thank you. So people choose parties across two different reasons, because academics are not 100% sure that why people do it, but there are two broad conceptions. One is this proximity, that you will close, you've got 2 or 3 or 4 political parties, and you will close your proximity to them. You don't like everything that they do, but you think, I was talking to one American, and you say, why are you voting for Donald Trump? And he said, because he doesn't hate people like me. That's the proximity tradition. He may not be getting everything right, but he stands for my values and my beliefs. And then there's the other, which is called the directional model, where voters choose people who are on the same side as them. So I'm on the left, so I support people on the left. I'm on the right, so I support people on the right. They're quite similar, they're splitting hairs, but it leads to the next couple of things that I would like to address. That we can see things like debates about immigration is interesting in the taxi driver bringing me here. The first thing after the pleasantries, it was immigration. He started talking to me about immigration. It's such a hot topic in Ireland at the moment that the taxi driver is raising it to me after saying, where are you from? And then we've got this idea of globalization. You've got this new globalist versus a sort of a nation-state way of seeing the world. And these are starting to become more salient in the eyes of economic questions. So the cultural access. And then people are losing the relationship between working class and labour. This has been diminishing for years. As I said, it's not even that tight, but there's been a realignment where working class people don't see that they're going to automatically vote for Labour. They didn't anyway, but even the ones that did are having it loosened up. Why? Because a growing rejection of liberalism. But let's not talk about working class people like they're a caricature. They hold left-wing and right-wing views like most people. Most people, unlike in this room, I know that you've worked out what you believe, and you probably take it premise, conclusion. You think about it really logically, and you think, well, if 1 + 2 = 3. Guess what? The 96% of people don't think like that. And they have what's called cross-pressured. This is what they're cross-pressured. There's the nice, I thought, whoa, being pulled apart. So you may be conservative on cultural, but you're socialist on economics. Or you could be liberal on economics and culturally conservative, and all the rest. All the things. You really like the environment, but you're free market, and so whatever it may be. So they are not rationalizing their political beliefs. So they're going to do 4 things. They're going to either put their cultural views and identity first and vote accordingly. They are either going to prioritize their economic beliefs and interests. Let's say they're economically insecure, so they go with what they think is the economic situation which will suit them. They might go, oh, I'm not sure, and split the difference and go, oh, I'll vote for a third party or a protest party because I'm just not quite sure. None of them speak to me, so I'll vote something else. Or they will prioritize their conservative because they hold them more fundamentally. That's an interesting thing about what we found in working class voters, is that they hold their conservative values more deeply because it's on things that they rely to them as a person. Guess what? If you satisfy someone's economic needs, they go on to the things that they hold more deeply, which is cultural identity and history. So that's a thing for conservatives to think. Well, if we satisfy their economic needs, then they're not going to go away and go, thank you very much, and then not vote for you again. They'll actually move on to their cultural interests and then vote for you even more so. So it's in your Conservative Party's interest to make sure that working class people feel economically secure, like giving them the right to buy their council houses. So, Conservative parties win elections when they win working class votes. If you want to win an election, you've got to win working class votes. Working class people vote Conservative when their values align in a proximity with Conservative parties. So when the Conservatives give a reason to vote Conservative, working class people vote Conservative. So what's the future then, Conservative future? Well, if we keep moving beyond a post-material age, in other words, if people keep prioritizing culture over economics, we can see the salience of social political questions becoming more and more and more. People are going to be asking about their identity, their culture, their social institutions, their little platoons, and so on. This will raise the idea of patriotism. Patriotism will come and be really important. Interestingly, a mentor of mine, Roger Scruton, he thought that before he passed away, one of the pressing things to do was to try and create a narrative where you can have left-wing patriots. You can be on the left and patriotic about your country. So I think that's really important. If Conservatives can pull them, and you can see it. You can see people who say now, I've always thought myself on the left. This woke nonsense is pushing me more to the right. No, they're actually starting to realize their underlying beliefs and understand that what they really, truly hold dear. So there's going to be questions of family coming up. That can Conservative Party defend the family, the marriage, and so on, the institutions? And if they can do this, working class voters will continue as they do, and in more so vote for Conservative parties. Thank you very much.
Very nutritious set of reflections there from our panelists. Now, I will ask them a couple of questions each, maybe one question each. How much time do we have, Robert? Are we doing okay? It's a question I have. And then we'll open up to audience questions, because I'm sure you have lots to say. So I suppose I'll start with you, Niamh. I will never cease to be amazed at the state of Celtic nationalism. It's very surprising to me that are people who see themselves as having engaged in a long struggle to throw off the yoke of British colonialism. All of a sudden, the Uniparty in Ireland then surrenders to global interests and imports, foreigners, to the point where they have a foreign-born population of, as you say, up to 30%. And all of the parties and all of the movements that were engaged in that struggle support this change. The question I have for you is, how do you assess the prospects of a new party coming in and breaking that stranglehold?
Well, I suppose in the first instance, why did Ireland, after a very long, after being a colony for such a long time, and then eventually winning part freedom, seem to kind of acquiesce so quickly then to say having its sovereign rights taken away by the EU and all that. That's actually a very complex question, because you'd have to go back to the Civil War and look who went into government after the Civil War. And there was certainly a trend in our history that was very anti-national. So you had people who were in government and who filled the positions of power who saw nationalism as a very bad thing. And that filtered down kind of into schools, into various different policies. And I think helped create this kind of mindset where we went into Europe almost feeling as very much a junior partner, and feeling that the European Union was entitled perhaps to give us our laws or to dictate to us how to run our country, because that was the kind of mindset that had unfortunately come into dominance, I think, after the Civil War in Ireland. But to what's happening now, it's funny because I think a sense of national identity, a sense of wanting to belong to something, to a nation, is a very, very strong instinct in people, in ordinary people. And it is quite extraordinary to see how it has come to the fore, I think, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, when people are seeing radical changes happening in their country, that they're not allowed to discuss it. If they discuss it, they're right-wing, they're racist, they're bigots. And I've talked a lot to people on protests in places like Newtown Kennedy, in Coolock, in Finglas, elsewhere, very ordinary small villages, very ordinary areas right throughout the country. And the notion that they're being directed by some puppet master far-right shadow figures is just ludicrous. These are almost always very ordinary people who are just worried and concerned and who don't like what's happening to the country. They don't like what's happening. They don't like the fact that it's not discussed with them. They don't like this very radical change. They don't seem to identify with what's happening in their community, with people around them anymore, and they find that really concerning. Most of those people are looking for somebody to vote for. They're looking in dismay at what Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are offering. And Fine Gael is doing some tough talk at the moment around immigration. So it's saying things like, we're going to stop people coming in without passports. As if that was a step that was needed to be taken. That should have been done automatically. And they're kind of making noises in the right direction, I think, to shore up their own vote. But if Fáil and Fine Gael get back into power, the government, I think the situation will get radically worse. The problem for voters, of course, is that the opposition party, Sinn Féin, have been equally terrible about open borders. So they've really dropped, what people say about Sinn Féin now is that they're more red than green. They dropped nationalism, I think, quite a long time ago. They're very focused on kind of internationalism. They're very much in favour of Ireland, of globalism, of Ireland kind of having open borders and welcoming people from all around the world. How does that tie to Pearse's vision of Ireland? It doesn't, is the short answer. It doesn't tie to it at all. So what do people do in that instance? The problem facing Ireland, and I think it faced every other European country, but a lot of those countries came to this problem a decade ago. So the new parties that have broken through, the new parties that are now gaining in popularity, that hasn't happened overnight. It's probably been a decade or more, am I correct? In build-up of support for those positions and for those parties. Will we see some kind of a breakthrough in the elections, which are going to be probably in November? I don't know. It's very difficult to set up a political alternative. It's not easy. Are the kind of structures that are starting to be put into place, is everything too fractured, at the moment to have a kind of a coherent political answer? I suppose time will tell. I don't have that short answer for you.
Moving across the Irish Sea, Daniel, you mentioned that Conservatives can and indeed do win the working classes when they pitch to them as a group and agree to represent their values and to stand for their values and indeed for their interests as well. But there is a widespread perception among the working classes of Britain, and I think it's in the main correct, that they at scale gambled on this Conservative Party in 2019 and were swiftly betrayed. And that was reflected, of course, in the recent election results, which was no love fest for Keir Starmer, by the way. I mean, Labour only won around 20% of the vote, but a lot of the people who had been instrumental for Boris Johnson's realignment in politics in 2019, a lot of them either stayed at home, voted for reform, or reverted to their tribal Labour loyalty without really assessing Starmer very much or what he would be about. And of course, in the riots recently, those riots and those protests have been disproportionately concentrated in those sorts of red wall seats. And I expect that the cloth-eared way in which Starmer has addressed legitimate grievances around replacement migration and other concerns that people have in those neighborhoods will be remembered come the next election. But my question is this. Given that people feel as though they gambled on the Tories in 2019 and didn't get an awful lot for it, do you think that the Conservative Party itself, considered as a mainstream institution, can rebuild that coalition and get that magic going again in 2029? Or will it take a fresher party? And of course, there are analogues on the continent as well.
I think that that the anger at the Conservative Party was real, but I do think the Conservative Party is extremely well in Britain at revitalising itself and changing itself and pulling on different strings and traditions that it holds, and to be able to then mould itself and reimagine itself again. I think it's very good at that. The one thing that apart from that, being able to do that, another thing that's you got to remember is that it's got long institutional history, but not just history, it's literally got bricks and mortar in constituencies. It has that network, it has the office, it knows where the voters are. Its data on VIs, as they call it, voting intention, is incredibly sophisticated. They know how many times you have voted, and if you go out and vote, they have got very good information on how you vote and if you swing one way or another between Conservative and somewhere else. So their ground game is incredibly strong, where I think Reform has got a very strong, with Farage, an air game. It's got the airwaves and so on, but it's very weak on the ground. It doesn't have that same embeddedness into constituencies. It doesn't have election agents that have been working the patch for 40 years, and they know the good spots and the not so good spots. So that is an incredible advantage that the Conservative Party has, not just over something where like Reform, but also over Labour, Liberal Democrats, and any other party. And you see this, let me give one example. You see the Green candidate, he comes walking down your street, he's got a plastic bag of Tesco, which is very weird for a Green candidate to do this. It's not, the optics are not good. But he's just knocking on every door. And you look at the Conservatives, they're not knocking on every door. They've crunched the numbers. They know Mrs. Ward at number 29 votes 10 out of 10 in elections. She's going to vote. And last time it was a flip between Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. So they send someone to your door, knocks on your door, and knows all that information about you. It's incredibly important and tool. So I think you can't rule them out because of those two things.
It's also a barrier to entry, isn't it?
It is,
like
absolutely.
Enormous infrastructure and the knowledge and everything that goes with that. You know, if you're trying to set up a new political party, how do you possibly compete with that?
And that's why they have been the dominant party on the right. And until very, very recently, no party on the right has been able to grow, unlike on the left, where you've got Labour, Lib Dem, Greens, etc. Until very recently. So the Conservatives have actually made a strategic error, allowing a party to grow on its right, but it's still so hard to do that, to win. It's a huge... Michael Porter, he's a business strategist, and when you set up a business, there's 5 forces, and he says one of the first things that you do after you set up a business is that you put the barriers to entry up. You don't want other competitors to come in. It's the first thing you do. Porter's 5 forces. Number 1, barriers to entry. Conservative Party knows that, and they do it.
Yeah.
But another thing I would add to that, though, is that the Conservative Parliamentary Party knows that as well. And so for people who aren't aware, one of the things that makes Britain's system, the Tory party's system of electing new leaders, very different from that which exists in the United States, is that it's the Conservative Parliamentary Party which, generally speaking, let's be honest, is the most wed and is the least likely to try and take up Daniel on his offer of trying to pitch itself to working class voters. It's very entrenched, it's very Cameronite, it's very centre-right and wet about things. Those are the precisely the people who choose who the final two candidates are, who then go to the voters. And then once you get to that final round, all of a sudden popular democratic support comes into the picture. Whereas in the United States, the candidates need to win the base first. Yeah. It's completely the other way around, which is why you can get entryism of a Trumpian kind that you can't get in the British case. And so my concern again is that despite all of this local knowledge about voting intentions, about people's preferences, there's been very little sign of that getting the Conservative Parliamentary Party in Westminster getting wind of that. And so my question, I suppose, is this: do you see a candidate in the current Conservative Party election who can take you up on your offer of pitching to working class voters, actually get into the final round where democratic pressures come into it?
Short answer, no.
Right.
No, not yet. We'll see who the final two are. They've all got, I think Kemi Badenoch is very aware of the cultural elements. I think Robert Jenrick is trying to go along economic aspects. I think Tom Tugendhat is very good on China, for example. But he's not going to cut through on cultural issues. James Cleverly is a really, really decent man. He's a lovely chap, and
but
I don't think his strategy is right. He's trying to essentially balance two wings. It's great for an aeroplane, but it's not good for a political party. Strategy, your communication. One of the things that I read and I learned from Anne Widdecombe, she's a wonderful woman, she's great, is your political messaging has to be simple. It has to be. Actually, we all say you need nuance, and we all love nuance, and that's a really nuanced answer. Actually, with political messaging, it has to be simple. This is our policy, this is how we're going to do it, and this is how it makes you better. This is how you will benefit from it. Simple. If you mucky it all up with nuance messaging, you're not going to win.
Do you think it also needs to be true, or at least have the appearance of being true? And I think sometimes, like when we're speaking about, and I understand this is important discussion, and it has to be had, but you know, how to harness working class voters, whether you're Labour or whether you're Conservative. And until recently in Ireland, we kind of didn't really have that divide. It was a different kind of divide after the Civil War. But I think voters can feel that the political parties are more self-serving than ideological, you know, and that really the person who should matter most, the voter, isn't actually that important. And that kind of goes to your point, you know what I mean, that you have this establishment within the Tories who will decide who gets to stand in the election, and often that they are not thinking about who the voter would like best, because maybe they're not thinking about doing the best thing for the voter.
And there was, of course, that entrenched Republican establishment as well, who definitely did not want to see Trump win in 2016. Yeah. They were all on the side of Jeb Bush, but because the processes were slightly different and there were more democratic selection pressures, Trumpian populism broke through. But that will never happen with someone like Farage and the Tory party. They probably wouldn't even admit him as a member, let alone have him whittled down to one of the last two in an election campaign. So it is an entrenched problem. So it is one of the areas where a strength, as you describe it, Dan, can also be a major weakness. Now, I think we're going to go to questions now. Does anyone want to ask anything? I'll let Robert select who he thinks should have the mic. There we go.
Thank you. Miguel from Portugal. I have three questions that I'd like to ask Dan. In your presentation of the Conservative success in Europe, you mentioned Sweden and Finland and Italy. No Hungary? Then I'm interested in knowing what exactly is the percentage of voters that split the difference. And then just the final thing, the post-material political arena, it can lead to defending more values-based policies, but then it can also lead to first world problems derived identity politics, as we've seen with wokeism. And just to end, I come I've had experience in two different types of parties. I started with a centrist party, then I moved to a populist party, and I think the problem that I see in the criticism of populism is that I don't think people appreciate how corrupted the serious, moderate, professional centre-right parties have become, to the extent, and this is, I'm sure, not exclusively the situation in Portugal, where you see the professional cadres who are prepared to rule and govern with maturity, defending that it's easier to talk to the Marxist and Trotskyist parties than it is to ally with the new populists, which I think is nonsense. Thank you.
Great, thanks for your questions. Portugal, wonderful country, love it, great stuff. First, number one, why not Hungary? I used to work there. I go to Hungary on a regular basis, so I just thought it was too obvious. So I just thought I'd try and give something else, which was try not to say the obvious. Number two, I didn't quite understand that one. But the third question is that too many political parties think in two separate ways, and in a way that they should, but they need to join it up. So there's politics of elections to get you over that line into government to win. There's also the politics of governance. Once you get into government, and you need to then govern. Political parties, unfortunately, recently have seen these as two separate things. You have the politics of election, and guess what? You get into government, and you realise you've not thought about a lot. And then you've got others saying, we're in governance now, we need to be statesmanlike, we need to come to the centre. It doesn't matter all the stuff that we said during the election, we'll throw that out. And no, that's wrong, because then all the people who voted for you, they'll feel betrayed when you throw it out when you govern from the centre. So the cultural and economic need to be intertwined into two things, politics of election and politics of governance, and they need to come together.
Hi, Roger Berkeley from Ireland. Quick question for Dan. You mentioned that obviously there's a high barrier to entry for the likes of Reform because of how strong the Tory ground game is, but they have a strong air game, obviously with Nigel Farage. Just generally for new parties coming in, whether it's in Ireland or the UK, if you can only pick one, which one is more important, the ground game or the air game?
One of the first things that I was taught at university is don't go into false dichotomies. So I'll reject the dichotomy, first of all, if you don't mind, but I will answer the question, though. If you look at the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom, look at the Liberal Democrats, they got fewer votes than Reform. I think they got, someone correct me, but about 3.7 million. Reform got about 4.1. Something like that, roughly. But they definitely got less. But they got nearly, roughly speaking, 60 seats. Why? Because they've got an incredibly excellent ground game. Everyone knows if you've competed against Liberal Democrats, they're like, I don't say this nastily, they're like cockroaches. You hit one and another one comes up and they're literally going. They've got a really, really good ground game, which they've not got for Reform. So let's say if I were advising the Liberal Democrats, I'd say you've got to improve your air game. And if I was advising Reform, I'd say you need to now get your ground game sorted. You need to be embedded in these constituencies. You need to be attending everyday events. You need to be getting your data collected, know exactly where your voters are, how often do they vote, do they need to be told to come out and vote. Also, get into those charities, get onto these boards, become school governors, and so on. And then you embed it into the community. So they've got the top down, and they need the bottom up. The Liberal Democrats have got the bottom up, and they need the top down. So I think they both need to be married up if you're going to be able to displace another big party. And that's what I think that would be the same in any electoral support, that you need both. You need someone who can communicate across television and radio and social media, but you need someone to knock on doors, collect the data, utilise the data and send their troops into the right places, not everywhere, not every street, not every door, then you will win.
Thanks. I'd like to, John O'Sullivan, I'd like to ask the same question to all three candidates because both the countries, we're talking about Britain and Ireland, and other countries too represented here, have the same problem, which is how do we get an election-winning, lowercase Conservative party into power? Now, Harrison, I'd like to ask how he thinks that could be done, and by which party, because the trend of by-election results is going to tell us a lot about that. Niamh, if you were trying to build an election-winning Conservative party, would you start with the third party, so to speak, a small party, and build from that, or would you try to get one of the major parties to desert that grand coalition, and if so, which party? Ignoring your own past political sins and commitment. And thirdly, I'd like to ask Daniel this. The people who would, like Matt Goodwin, who would like to see reform become the new political party of the right, all seem to say anyway, that they are in favour of ditching any form of economic liberalism. Does the record of the Conservative Party before Thatcher, from, let's say, Salisbury onward, does that justify that argument, or does it undermine it?
I'll begin by saying that I'm genuinely ambivalent at the moment about which party is going to be spearheading what we want to see. I've been quite encouraged by some of the noises in particular that Robert Jenrick has been making in the Conservative Party. He seems to have the zeal of a convert, and unlike Farage, one of the downsides, it goes back to the air game versus the ground game thing in some respects. There's nowhere near as much charisma there, but there is a massive attention to detail, which I think Farage fatally lacks, and it's one of the Achilles heels of populism, that because there's no credible risk of them finding themselves in government, they can afford to run a very vibes-based election campaign rather than one which is truly attentive to detail, and that does matter once you get into government. One potentially encouraging thing that could happen, it's a theory which I've had recently. I used to be of the view that it would be best for one of the wetter Conservatives to win, so that Reform would be able to distinguish themselves through the radical nature of the contrast that would exist, for example, between someone like Tom Tugendhat on the one hand and Farage on the other. I mean, Tom Tugendhat was literally boasting on Twitter the other day about how he's winning with Liberal Democrats in Cornwall. No one cares about that. That is not going to be crucial to any kind of winning coalition that we want to see to see materialize. So I used to think that would be best. I've now developed a slightly more audacious 4D chess style theory that it might actually be best for Jenrick to win the Conservative Party leadership. I mean, apart from anything else, he as I say, he seems to have the zeal of a convert. He's got Neil O'Brien in his corner. They've been putting together some really, really good data, marrying the kind of economic liberalism that you're talking about. In other words, a concern for us not being too generous when it comes to social housing and that sort of thing, with immigration restrictionism. That these two things can be brought together, the cultural and demographic concerns and economic good sense, when you find out that 70% of Somalis in London are on social housing, 55% of Pakistanis across the country are in social housing. There's a promising cocktail there of mixing sort of Ian Duncan Smith style concern about the welfare state with Farage immigration restrictionism, and Robert Jenrick is tapping into that. So it's very good. The audacious theory is that given that Reform really seems to have committed itself to becoming a replacement party now rather than just a UKIP-style pressure campaign, you might get this sort of virtuous spiral where both Reform and the Conservatives feel an immense pressure to outbid each other from the right, and the right understood in primarily demographic and cultural terms. And I think that would be very, very good indeed if they were trying to outdo each other on who could be more proximate to the sort of thing that we need to see. And I think the data shows at present that is a winning coalition. It's just a question of someone tapping into it.
So I suppose the first question as to whether we should give either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael another chance or try to change them from within. To be honest, no, I don't think that's possible. I think really what happened with both of those parties is a reflection on what happened in Ireland. Because Ireland used to be a conservative with a small c, like conservative, I hate to say, because of our history with England, especially with Margaret Thatcher, it wasn't a popular term in Ireland, but certainly it was a conservative country and a very Catholic country. And it's very much a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because the political establishment in particular cannot do enough to escape from what they see as the embrace of conservative or Catholic Ireland. And there isn't any liberal policy they will not embrace. So, for example, we had the Gender Recognition Act here years before you guys were even talking about it. There isn't anything that the kind of coalition of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who used to be the Conservative or centrist parties, won't do. They won't. There isn't any part of that ledge they won't climb out onto. And I think a lot of that is also because they were kind of led to believe by political advisors and strategists that the only vote worth chasing was the young vote and the female vote. And they became completely obsessed with this. For example, Fianna Fáil ignored its own grassroots and ignored its own members and chased the repeal vote, a vote to legalise abortion in Ireland, because they believed that would shore up the female vote and shore up young voters for them. And that never materialised for them. So, if you like, they lost some of their own members, they created difficulties with their own parties because they were endlessly chasing what they think is this liberal vote. I think what a large number of them forget is that there's a demographic change coming down the tracks, even leaving immigration aside, which is nothing like anyone has ever seen before. Because most of the people who are very liberal aren't having children, and their numbers, I think that imbalance, that very unprecedented shift, when that happens, political parties are not preparing for that at all. The other question you asked, I suppose, is, well, then what are you left with? What are you going to do? What's needed to build an alternative? And the problem, like I said before, is that there are 20% of the vote is there for the taking. This is the shame of it. It's equal or more than Fianna Fáil's vote. It's almost equal to Fine Gael's. It could be bigger than it. And it's the people who want to represent that vote are so fractured. And I know it's way easier said than done, but there has to be some kind of a coming together. I think to build any political party, you need vision. It's very hard to come together then and find your shared vision, but surely it can be done, because they are broadly in agreement on most of the policies and most of the issues. You need money. Anyone who thinks you can build a serious political movement without money is completely fooling themselves. And how can that be raised? That's a question for those parties. Can they tap into the mass of ordinary people who are angry about this through crowdfunding and things like that? I mean, that's not typically the route of political parties, but once they start to get representation and they get public funding, that'll resolve some of that. And then you need what you're talking about, energy, like feet on the street. Like with the vision will come intelligence and communication, things like that, but you absolutely need to marshal your troops and to make them work for you on the ground. And again, that comes with unity, I think, some kind of coherence as well. It can be done, but I'm glad I'm not the one doing it.
Then, Dan, would you like to take up the third part of John's question?
John, I think if those who would like to argue that economic liberalism has been a positive, I think you could, almost spoke about him earlier, I think you could go to Robert Peel and you could see about all the tariffs that he removed and on other things but food. And you could see the Laffer curve literally in action. The taxes were removed, regulations were reduced, and actually government tax revenue increased. So you could say it's an almost perfect case study for someone who wants to put the case forward for economic liberalism. I do think, though, since Major onwards, especially under Blair and Brown, there was a sort of perversion of economic liberalism, a misunderstanding of it. And I think that's what we're still living in Britain, is that economic liberalism is just allow the city to be unregulated and get as much, like Brown did, as much tax you can get from them, let the market rip, because then you can pay for loads of state aid, in welfare. And other things about that, how, and this, Burke said this, Hayek said this, about how social mores, norms, and culture, and the law, the rule of law, shape the market. So the market, it doesn't just, we shouldn't, you could say not regulated by the government, but it's regulated by your customs, your beliefs, contract. Why do you not make a contract? Because you might have a legal response, but also a cultural response. You'll lose goodwill and status. Don't work with that person because they break contracts. That's a norm, a cultural norm. So markets, like Hayek told us this, Burke told us this, work in a cultural framework. And if that cultural framework dissolves and you don't have neighbors knowing each other and you don't have people understanding their traditions or the idea of rule of law, then the market falls apart because there's nothing binding it together.
Thank you, Niamh. Thank you, Dan. Thank you all for listening. I believe it's time for lunch.